Welcome to Viewpoint. Prospects for an Israeli-Palestinian peace in the foreseeable future are bleak. On the Israeli side, settlements continue to expand while talks are rejected, and the public sentiment is firmly on the right. On the Palestinian side, reconciliation between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority has failed. The blockade in Gaza continues to isolate Gazans politically and economically. And the White House has concluded that achieving Israeli-Palestinian peace in the remainder of the Obama term may not be in the cards. For an analysis of the present situation and any insights into real changes on the horizon, I want to welcome Matthew Duss. Matt is president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Previously, he was a policy analyst at the Center for American Progress, where he focused on the Middle East and the U.S. national security interests and directed the Center's Middle East Progress Program. You also were one of the principal authors of a book on Islamophobia. I want to get to that maybe if we have time at the end. But I want to start on the peace agreement, which is something that is of concern to a lot of people. Not peace agreement, but the stagnation of any effort toward peace, and ask if we could pull apart each of the component, the groups, the entities that make this process up. First, the Israeli side.
Sure.
I frankly don't see any movement on the Israeli side or any hopeful signs. Lay out the landscape, if you would. What's going on in the Israeli side?
Yeah, I think right now we have Netanyahu, who manages a very slim coalition, but it's a very right-wing coalition. He won re-election last March, as many know, by appealing to Israelis' worst fears with some very clear anti-Arab race baiting in the last days of the campaign. And I think it's careful not to overinterpret that result in terms of Israelis' general predisposition toward a two-state solution. I think that if you look at the polls, they still do support the creation of a Palestinian state. They're just very pessimistic about getting there. But I think Netanyahu, in the absence of a strong labor, left-wing liberal leader, was able to really just exploit Israelis' fears of the region, and let's recognize that a lot of things that are happening in the region are troubling. But what he did was basically steal votes from parties to his right. So he's in a situation right now, even though he runs this coalition, he's still beholden to some parties that are even more extreme than he is. And there really doesn't seem to be any party or any leader to his left from what's traditionally called the peace camp that is really going to challenge him. Isaac Herzog, the leader of the Labor Party, just a couple weeks ago announced what he's presenting as an alternative. A plan to separate from the Palestinians, to withdraw to the large settlement blocks, to put up a fence and separate Jerusalem, to keep the Jewish part of Jerusalem Jewish and the Palestinian part Palestinian. And I think on the one hand, it's somewhat attractive that he might present an alternative, but if you actually look at what he's proposing, it frankly just brings us to the same place that I think Netanyahu does, and that's with the Palestinians in the West Bank contained within a set of reservations with no real sovereignty. It would deepen the kind of isolation of Palestinian communities in Jerusalem. So it's really not much of an alternative, but that's the leader of the opposition. So that's the situation we've got in the Israeli politics.
And
right
because
now.
Netanyahu's coalition is slim, 61 votes, any risks he might be asked to take, freezing settlements, for example, become problematic.
Right.
And then there's the other side of that, and that is his continuing expansion of settlements and land grabs that have taken place throughout. The situation is dire on the ground that way. I mean, in terms of the fact that where settlements are growing, shuts off the prospect of any contiguity for a Palestinian entity.
Right. And here I would point to some things that members of the U.S. administration have been saying. I wrote a piece for Tablet Magazine a couple weeks ago looking at this. Going back to December, Secretary of State Kerry made some remarks to the Saban Forum here in Washington, where he came out and said that Israel is pursuing a number of policies in the West Bank that looked as if they're reversing the Oslo process. And he used those words. I think it was really significant that he came out and said this. Rather than giving the Palestinians more authority and more control, the reverse is happening. There's more demolition of homes. There's the failure to give any permits, virtually any permits, for the building of new Palestinian homes or buildings, or enabling any kind of Palestinian economic growth. That critique was soon repeated by Ambassador Power at the Haaretz New Israel Fund conference in New York, and then it was repeated in very much the same language by the ambassador to Israel, Shapiro, at the INSS conference. Those are the remarks that caused all the big hubbub over the double standard in the West Bank, which is, of course, completely 100% true. But I think the double standard remark tended to overshadow the fact that he was reiterating what I think is a very significant critique from the U.S.
I did a study a few years back, called it 20 Years After Oslo, looking at the polling trends in the 20 years. And what I found was interesting is Israelis favor the peace process, but don't favor the terms, what it would involve, surrendering land, dealing with the refugee issue, border issue, etc. They kind of want the illusion of a process to continue, but they're not ready for it. Netanyahu plays off of that.
I think he does, and I might pitch it a slightly different way. I think if you ask Israelis, do you favor the ultimate result? They will say yes, but once you get down into those individual questions, dividing Jerusalem, transfer of close to 100,000 settlers or more back into Israel, then that support tends to weaken. I think Netanyahu does...
Which means, in effect, that the Israelis have created both a population base of support and also conditions on the ground that appear irreversible, other than to have a civil war in Israel, which no one seems ready to have.
Irreversible, at the very least, extremely politically difficult. But I think, just going back to what you had said, Netanyahu does play off this, but I think it's not that he doesn't want negotiations. He keeps saying he does want negotiations. He wants negotiations to go on forever and ever.
Which also plays off that theme.
Again, the more time we can sit and talk, whereas Israel continues to build settlements and actually create the reality on the ground, which is what we've seen over the past several decades.
And also was troubled by the language the Obama administration used, which was to refer to continued settlement activity as illegitimate, but then refer to settlements as realities on the ground. In other words, illegitimate while you do it, but once you've done it, it's a reality and they can't be reversed. Almost accepting that fact.
I mean, I think that's something that we saw starting with the Bush administration with the letter to Sharon in 2004, which I think was, I think will be looked back on as a pivotal moment when the two-state solution became really much more endangered.
One of the more frightening trends of this government is not just the violence done to Palestinians in terms of the land grabs and the house demolitions and the checkpoints and the humiliation that follows them daily, but it's now the civil liberties issues in Israel itself, with the Israeli left under attack and Israeli Arab Knesset members under attack. Talk a bit about that and where that is going to go, because given the coalition partners that he has, this is a very hardline group of people who are pursuing rather intolerant policies.
I think that's right, and I think what we're seeing, and it's important to note that many Israelis predicted that this would happen once Israel decided to essentially make the occupation permanent, is that at some point Israel would basically import the policies of occupation into Israel proper. And I think that is what we're seeing. Efforts to stigmatize and incite against NGOs and civil society organizations that highlight human rights abuses in the occupied territories, groups that try to organize politically to end the occupation. And a lot of these groups on the right that are making these, what I can only call McCarthyite attacks against Israeli liberals and progressives, have very, very close ties, and in some cases actually work in the offices of Israeli right-wing members of the Knesset and members of the government. So it's not like this is something that's only happening in civil society. This is something that has support from the highest levels of this government.
And then there's the price tag movement, the extremist settlers who have taken the law into their own hands, the law such as it is, into their own hands, and struck out at Palestinians, both in their homes and in their places of worship.
That's right.
Let's look at the Palestinian side, which is not any more promising. Mahmoud Abbas, on his last legs,
Yeah. Abbas, there was a period, I would say, probably between, when Abbas came in, one of the reasons why the Bush administration favored him was because they felt that Arafat had been discredited because of what they saw as his double game with regard to terrorism. Abbas, they saw as a leader who was strongly against the use of terrorism, strongly in favor of nonviolence and diplomacy. And I think he's kept to that, which is one of the reasons, we've seen the continued cooperation between the Israeli security forces and the Palestinian security forces in the West Bank. But that's been politically difficult for him. Because this gives weight to this argument that many Palestinians make that you're essentially serving as a subcontractor for the occupation. It would be easier for Abbas to rebut this argument if he had anything to show for all these years of negotiations, for years of diplomacy, but he really doesn't. And at the same time, even though I want to give credit where credit is due on that, I think it is also worth noting that, he is now in, I believe, the 11th year of a 4-year term. There is really no successor. There are a number of successors who are talked about, but there really is no process for succession. There's been a complete lack of political reform, and there's actually been a measure of crackdown on Palestinian civil society, not only by the Israeli forces, but also by the Palestinian security forces, that is really troubling.
So when Netanyahu says there's no partner, the Palestinians are in disarray, part of it is due to Israeli policy, but part of it is due to the fact that the Palestinians have not stepped up their game in terms of building a political movement that could not only find a successor, but also create a mass base of support.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's recognizing and acknowledging that they are in very difficult circumstances, but there are steps that I think could have been taken, have not.
The being a subcontractor, the Palestinians make the argument that they are a dependency at this point on the international community,
Right.
and if they don't cooperate with Israel, if they don't continue the crackdown, they lose international funding, and it is the largest employer of Palestinians.
Right.
This is not how it was supposed to be. Palestinians were to be able to create an economy, but without the ability to import or export or do business. It is a civil service that has become the mainstay of maybe 1/3 of the population.
Right, and that's sort of the catch-22 we're locked inside here, is that in order for the Palestinian economy to develop in the way that would sustain a normal and kind of mature politics and the development of the institutions of a state, you need freedom of movement, you need investors to feel confidence that, when they invest in a new whatever water treatment plant or what have you, that it's not going to be destroyed by the Israelis, it will be allowed to develop and grow. And the only way to do that is for the Israelis to kind of take their foot off and ease up the occupation. But this Israeli government has no interest in doing that. In fact, they're doing quite the opposite.
Then there's Hamas. They were elected way back, 10 years ago. Instead of functioning as an elected body, they wanted to continue as a guerrilla movement, fighting a resistance, quote unquote, using tactics that can only be described as terrorism. I mean, suicide bombers are not resistance, in my humble opinion. And now they're locked in Gaza with a population of 1.8 million or so, really struggling. The situation in Gaza is deplorable.
It
and is not getting the attention it deserves.
It's not, and it's very troubling to see, the situation inching steadily back to one of conflict, with Hamas continuing under pressure. The failure I think after the last Gaza war, there was, as we saw in previous rounds of fighting, the international community, the U.S. included, saying, oh, this cannot be allowed to happen again. Let's try to get our heads together and deal with this problem. But there are some key issues that remain in order to get the Palestinian Authority back into Gaza. There's a great deal of mistrust between these two groups. They've got bad blood going back a long way. You have the situation, just to describe it briefly, of civil servants in Gaza Hamas civil servants, whereas the Palestinian Authority civil servants have continued to be paid, dealing with this problem of Hamas civil servants that have not been paid. This is one of the reasons Hamas was under such pressure, was the closing of the smuggling tunnels by Egypt, which had been a major source of revenue. Hamas still remains, they have no real sources of revenue at this point. So again, it's how do you deal with Israel's basic security requirements? How do you bridge this gap politically between these two major Palestinian movements? It's always the question of what comes first and which one of these pieces has to move.
And reconciliation with Hamas is not going anywhere. There have been several efforts, and there are still efforts underway, but they don't seem to be producing any fruit.
I mean, I think you see every year or so moves. Different representatives will meet, whether in Cairo or Istanbul or wherever, and try to find some formula. But the situation is that there is more, that the leaders of these two factions feel that they have more to lose than to gain. And unfortunately, the people who suffer the most are the Palestinian people themselves, particularly the people of Gaza.
Well, the U.S. has locked everyone out of the picture. The Europeans periodically make an effort to get involved, but they defer to the U.S. And the problem with the U.S. appears to be that it is either unwilling or politically unable to take the leadership that would create a framework for peace. That situation also doesn't seem to be getting any better here.
I think it's getting a little bit better. I think what we've seen over the past year, well, since the collapse of the Kerry initiative in April 2014, we saw the Obama administration say a number of things indicating that they recognize that the bilateral path was now shut. Obama, as previous presidents, had constantly stressed the fact that the way to deal with this was with Palestinians and Israelis sitting around a table, with the U.S. acting as mediator. I think the end of the Kerry process and multiple U.S. officials coming out and saying that the one thing that really doomed that process was the settlements. Not the only thing, but one of the most significant things. Clearly, in U.S. terms, putting a greater share of the blame on the Israelis, and then saying the bilateral path is now shut, and indicating in various ways that they might be a bit more amenable to doing this through an international forum, whether the UN, whether an international conference. That's still unclear, but I think they have signaled that they understand that this needs to be, that the international consensus needs to be mobilized in some way. It's just not clear how they want to do that.
I always argue that it's hard for the U.S. to play the role of mediator or negotiator when they're a coat holder and cheerleader for one side. I mean, that's kind of the way they've, and Congress is the enabler here.
Yeah.
As I look at legislation currently before the Congress and past legislation that has gone through Congress, I think the American public doesn't know of all of they know about the aid, but they don't know about all of the political things that get done that cripple Palestinian ability to function, cripple the United Nations ability to function, and put the U.S. in a very difficult position, a compromised position in the world community.
Yeah, I think over the last year or so, we've seen Congress, with the urging of AIPAC, really focusing on this issue of BDS,
which is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement that has gained some ground on a popular level here in the U.S. and in Europe.
Right, and I bring that up because they're using the specter or threat, as they would put it, of BDS to do something which actually has very little to do with BDS, and that's to kind of encourage, force, call on the United States in its trade relations with other countries to oppose efforts to create consequences for settlements. We saw the European Union announce several months ago, they weren't new labeling measures, they were just stipulating that they would now enforce existing measures regarding the labeling of products from Israeli settlements, which must be labeled differently from products coming from pre-67 Israel. We saw a strong reaction in Congress from that.
Even though the U.S. does it itself.
Even though the U.S. has a similar, it's not exactly the same, but it is similar. Products from the West Bank cannot be labeled made in Israel. So what we've seen in response to this is an effort to basically redefine and legitimize the settlements. as part of Israel. We've seen different kinds of language. Post 67 Israel is one of my favorites. Calling the TPA, the Trade Protection Authority, from last summer, called on U.S. trade representatives to prevent efforts to boycott or sanction products from Israel or territories controlled by Israel. There are all these small phrases.
That bill passed.
It did,
and as a veto-proof majority in both houses. The president has issued a statement, but will he issue a signing statement which would actually nullify the effect of this, or we haven't seen that yet?
Well, he issued a statement, or the State Department issued a statement, as they did with the passage of the most recent trade bill, saying that this, basically calling out this one passage and saying this does not change our policy, which is that the settlements are not part of Israel. So I do appreciate that for because that
is it binding?
Well, they're just saying that this is not going to change U.S. policy. And of course, Congress didn't like that because they feel like we passed the law, you should go and do it. But I think what the administration is doing here is actually pretty valuable. It's not only valuable with regard to the debate over these issues in the U.S., it's also an important signal to the Europeans to say that the U.S. is not going to change its policy. So I think my view is that the Europeans would not have moved forward with what they're doing without at least a yellowish green light from the U.S. And I think that's what's going on here. And this is in keeping with what I was saying about the Obama administration being much more into the idea of sort of mobilizing the international consensus here and internationalizing the solution.
Let's look at a quote from Rob Malley, which I thought was quite interesting. He is the senior advisor in the White House, dealing with not just Arab Israeli, the entire Middle East, and now actually is specializing on the anti-ISIS coalition. Rob says the absence of a resolution is fueling extremism and making it very difficult to get to the kind of open cooperation we really need to get changes on the ground. That was an interesting kind of there's those who've argued from the Israeli side that solving the issue has nothing to do with anything. It's not going to make the Middle East peaceful. Rob is saying that it would make our ability to combat extremism easier if we could build open relationships with Arab governments and they could work with us, based on trust. I want you to comment on that, but I also want you to comment on the issue that gets ignored in all of the discussions, and that is the issue of justice and of the human rights of a captive people who are literally being destroyed. The quality of their life is being destroyed by this malignant occupation. Talk first about Rob's sort of strategic view of this.
Yeah, I think the way that Rob phrased it, as he tends to do, was spot on. It's not as if, and I don't think anyone serious has ever really come out and claimed that if we solve the Palestinian issue, there will be peace across the region. But it is noting that this conflict is related to a number of others. It's an issue that extremists across the region exploit quite effectively because, as your work has shown, your polling has shown, this is an issue that remains very salient for publics across the region. And Rob wasn't the first person to say this. I would go back to something the former CENTCOM Chief General Mattis said a couple of years ago. In his words, I pay a security price in the Middle East every single day because of the irresolution of this conflict. Go back even farther, Mattis's predecessor, David Petraeus, as head of CENTCOM, in his testimony to Congress.
Actually, the former generals all say this, the CENTCOM generals and also the chiefs of staff. But James Baker, in September of 1990, around the time of Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, said the same thing in Congress. It's something that is acknowledged, but policy doesn't follow. Talk about the second part, if you would, and that is the fact that granted, Israel's dysfunctional, Palestinian society is dysfunctional, the U.S. is dysfunctional, but what doesn't get paid attention to is what's happening to real people on there. When you get 13, 14-year-old girls carrying scissors and wanting to stab people with it, something has happened to their lives that lead them to this option. That's what Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was trying to point out, that there is a destruction of life going on here, and no attention is paid to that part of it.
And Ban Ki-moon, as I wrote shortly after that, he was echoing what Israel's own security chiefs have said, heads of the IDF intelligence and the Shin Bet security services, that it's this lack of any hope this situation of complete hopelessness that is fueling these, it's just heartbreaking to see these children really taking these knives and going out because they have nothing, there's no alternative. They see this, they see their parents having grown up this way, this is what the future holds for them. And it really is one of a system of just a complete lack of dignity, a lack of justice, and it's something that is utterly inconsistent with American values. It is a situation of radical political inequality that I think Americans really need to take a harder look at. Yes, there are security issues to discuss. Yes, there are political and diplomatic issues that need to be discussed. But the situation as it exists right now is one of discrimination and inequality that I think really is offensive to American values.
Hopeless, but there are some developments taking place under the surface. Talk a little about them, the French initiative, and what might be in the works, and what you think the president may do in the 1 year left for him to deal with this issue.
Well, I think we saw a few weeks ago the French Foreign Minister Fabius announcing, an international conference bringing in leaders from the Arab world, making the Arab Peace Initiative from 2002 a part of this. Something along, having talked to the French embassy, I think what they're thinking of is something along or similar to the model of the P5+1 that was used with Iran, which is to say some of the leading countries of Europe, the United States acting with the UN's imprimatur to try and move the process forward. Now, I think some people expected that this idea might die when Fabius left office, as he did just a couple of weeks ago, but his successor has just recently said, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that no, France is actually going to continue to push forward with this. The Israelis, in particular Prime Minister Netanyahu, are upset because the French have said, if we're not successful, we're going to go ahead and recognize the state of Palestine. Netanyahu has presented this as an incentive for failure. But leaving that aside, I think although President Obama has said that he doesn't expect that we'll solve this problem before the end of his term, I think in various ways, going back to even when he was a candidate, his speech he gave in Cairo in 2009, I think President Obama has indicated that he gets this issue at a deeper and different level than a lot of presidents have. So I think it'll be interesting to watch, how he tries to put this situation on a better footing, or at least arrest the deterioration that we're seeing now, because it really needs it.
The candidates, the debate has not been promising on the Republican side. Democrats haven't even been asked a question about it. The candidates have actually on the Republican side been quite outspoken. Is there a possibility that this issue becomes an issue that gets talked about? If the president does something, for sure it will be commented on. But if not, will it just remain below the surface as other issues trump? I didn't mean that as a pun.
Well, I think there are a number of things that could happen. There could be another upsurge in violence, even though what we've been seeing over the past month, since October at least, has been it's been a higher level of intensity of violence than we've usually seen. Certainly no one would wish for that, but I will say that this conflict, whether it's violence in Jerusalem or violence in Gaza or violence in other places in the West Bank, does have a way of reasserting itself time after time after time. And we may see that over the next few months, in which case I would expect both Senator Sanders and Secretary Clinton would comment.
Thanks very much for the conversation, Matt. That's all the time we've got for now. You can follow us on Twitter at AAIUSA or check out our website, aaiusa.org. Thanks for joining, and I'll see you next week on Viewpoint.